welcome to the platform, a Radio Nigeria program on politics and governance, and I'm David Umar. Oh yes. Corruption is a complex social, political, and economic phenomenon that affects all countries and undermines democratic institutions, slows economic development, and contributes to instability. It equally attacks the foundation of democratic institutions by distorting electoral processes, perverting the rule of law, and creating bureaucratic quagmires. The consequence of corruption is seen in all sectors of the economy, with salient ones recorded in health, education, finance, and security sectors. In October 2003, the General Assembly adopted the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and requested that the Secretary General designate the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime as the Secretariat for the Convention's Conference of State Parties. Since then, 190 parties have committed to the Convention's anti-corruption obligations, showing near universal recognition of the importance of good governance, accountability, and political commitment. The vast majority of United Nations member states, including Nigeria, are parties to the convention. The Assembly also designated 9th December as International Anti-Corruption Day to raise awareness on corruption and the role of the convention to combat and prevent it. In Nigeria, many anti-corruption agencies were established to tackle the menace of corruption. How have these agencies fared in tackling corruption in the country since their establishment? Have they met their mandate of fighting corruption and corrupt practices in the country? To discuss these and more, we have in the studio the Program Officer, Policy Innovation Center at the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, Mr. Femi Obidare. Welcome to the platform.
Thank you, David. Good morning.
It excites me to see when young men like me are all out for war against corruption.
Beautiful. Who says young, by the way?
We don't declare age.
Oh, well.
So let's begin.
Yes.
How do you perceive the impact of corruption on Nigeria's socio-economic development?
Well, I mean, that's a question that's it's obvious to everyone, right? That corruption itself is a major plug in the wheel of the socio-economic development of Nigeria, right? And we see that impact in every sphere. It's so terrible, such that it's even blamed for the recent removal of subsidy, right? Because of the issues that surround the siphoning of funds and all that around that. Again, I just remember as I was walking to the studio this morning, we were talking about the issue of Japa in the country. How several young, brilliant Nigerians, and I would say young Nigerians.
That tends to be the anthem now.
Not even just young Nigerians, even the ones in the older category, right? Are just relocating and porting out of the country. And the reason is because we know that corruption has a direct link with the reduction of national wealth, right? And which is supposed to be used generally in funding development courses and development work in the country. And so you'd find out that at the end of the day, every part and every aspect of society loses because of corruption, right?
Of course it does, and it's evident in all the sectors.
Absolutely.
Well, can you just share a specific example? You mentioned the JAPA one now, but can you also be more specific other examples of anti-corruption measures that have been taken in recent years by the Nigerian government to make sure to just curb corruption, just the way you talked about the subsidy removal earlier. Other measures.
Well, I mean, during your introduction, you did mention how that ONCAC, which is essentially the only universally legally binding conventional or let me say legal instrument, right, on anti-corruption across the world, was instituted in 2003, right? It was that same year that the government also passed the EFCC Act, we all know the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. It was 3 years before that the government instituted ICPC, Independent Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Commission. So as far back as the year 2000, the government has been involved, right, in several ways. And there are several other acts. There are several acts and several agencies and establishments. You have the Code of Conduct Bureau, you have the Bureau of Public Procurement, and several other agencies of government that seek in some way to drive the matter of anti-corruption and advance accountability and transparency in the system. But of course, the question remains that to what extent have these efforts been really, really effective in fighting the battle of corruption? And in answering that question, you want to take a look at the most popular index for measuring corruption in the world, the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, right? I wouldn't know if I'm going ahead, but in the year 2021, Nigeria ranked 154, which was the worst in 10 years. Prior to that time, we had just been sort of undulating between 130-something, 140-something, but 2021 reached its peak. And it was sort of a paradox, right? Because the government of the day at that time, one of the major tripods upon which the government got into power was to fight corruption. And it was sort of ironical that it was during that tenure that Nigeria ranked the highest.
So the corruption was fighting back.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, that's also a very important factor to consider, frankly, because really, like, we all know that popular book by one of our, that says that fighting corruption is dangerous. We know that. Dr. Kojiwala wrote that. So, yes, level of effectiveness, recently, in 2020, Nigeria still ranked 150 out of 180 countries as 150 least corrupt countries, which is not still very encouraging as such. So by way of measurement, the evidence is there that while there's been a lot of efforts on the part of government, at least to curb the menace of corruption, it has not particularly translated into stemming the tide of that problem. Yeah,
that particular problem.
Exactly.
Okay, let's go to the grassroots level now. In your opinion, what role can citizens actually play in combating corruption at the grassroots level?
Yeah.
Now, I'm asking this question now because we say we all belong to a local government, a ward in the country, and we all come from a family, right? Yeah. Now, there was a show on one of the FM stations, Capital FM to be precise, this morning, and we took an opinion poll that if you walk in on a document, the paper trail, implicating your parent or your spouse as corrupt, would you turn them in to the official? And of all the colors that called, well, how many colors that called? They said, no, I won't turn in my spouse. No, I won't turn in my father. No, I won't turn in my mother, and all of that. So in your opinion, what role can citizens play in combating corruption at the grassroots level?
Well, very important question you asked there, because even the agencies that are fighting corruption, agencies either from the government angle and even civil society organizations, are coming to realize something. Not long ago, Professor Babawale Olatunde, the provost of the Anti-Corruption Academy of Nigeria, domiciled within ICPC, made a very important observation that over the years, nearly 20 years, the strategy, the prevailing strategy that a lot of anti-corruption agencies have used or deployed, particularly the government-based one, has to do with what you call the law and order approach. That is the use of legislation, and then what primarily happens is that you go after people who have committed who have been proven to commit some measure of corrupt acts or practices, and then try to bring those people to law or to book. But we realize that despite that approach, it has not really helped as such. You still continue to have people still engaging in acts of corruption, despite the fact that they know that the legislation is there. And you see one of the rationalizations that happens most times is that people just sort of look at it like, all right, if, for example, the negative consequences by law of engaging in corruption sort of is far lesser or less burdensome than the accumulation of the wealth that comes from that, hey, they just damn the consequences and go ahead regardless, right? So now that caused a shift in thinking, which began to emerge in new thoughts, even among scholars globally, that let's begin to look beyond legislation and begin to consider what you call behavioral change, all right? And begin to look at that aspect of, now what behavioral change emphasizes really is that human beings behave in certain ways, in particular contexts, and those behaviors are guided by their context and a lot of times the values that they project. Right. Now, to your question about the matter of grassroots level and code, you will come to realize, if you study it objectively, that the matter of corruption really is a matter of corruption of values, right? And where values, the right kind of societal values, are not promoted, you would find out that, in a situation like, for example, in our country, I'll give you a case in point, you find a situation where those who engage in corrupt practices or who accumulate wealth in certain funny ways, sudden wealth or co, are celebrated. And the ones who accumulate wealth using those means, nobody questions, right? It's a case of calling the thief pleased or blessed. You appreciate the person who has stolen things. As far as he has the money to throw around, you really don't care. So there's a lot of societal influence, right? And societal value influence that affects the way corruption happens. And so if we don't begin to upload, because what you see is that there's been a divergence from certain norms and values, right? That fight corruption, even at the grassroots level, at the family level. The other day I was in a particular conference, the Behavioral Change Conference, and one of the CSO's representatives was talking about how that in primary school or secondary school elections now, primary school elections.
Oh, tell me about that.
Primary school elections, how parents are inducing their children to take gifts to go and give their colleagues or their fellow classmates so that those students can vote for them in just becoming the president of your primary school. From that age. And it's really worrisome, right? Because this is the future. These are the young people who are going to take position. Another case in point again, one of my friends just some months ago during the past SSE, she works for the government, she's a teacher, and she happened to invigilate. Because I work, they post them to different schools. Practically all the schools where she was to invigilate, the school authorities attempted to induce her to allow pupils to cheat during examinations. Now these are the bearers of quote unquote the values of society: parents, teachers, the educational institution, the family institution.
So sometimes some of the things the schools use to promote their integrity and all of that for more people to come in, where they tell you we do straight A's, 9 A's, and all of that. It's because of things like this.
Yeah, it's not even integrity they're promoting anymore. It's performance they're promoting. Performance is more like the end justifies the means. And that's wrong, actually, right? So if you look at it very closely, you realize that our society has become one in which corruption and corrupt practices have become normalized. And what I mean by normalized is that corruption is becoming both accepted and expected. And as long as we have that continuing in society, every other fight or battle against corruption will yield minimal results.
Definitely. Now, you said in your opening statement, you talked about establishing different arms of agencies to fight corruption since 2000 and thereabouts. Now, how effective has been the legal framework for the prosecution and prevention of corruption in Nigeria? Now, before we go into that, now, these agencies that have been created, we've had cases of duplication of duties. Sometime in the last administration, we had either DSS and EFCC back in who to go arrest someone. And then we've also had this issue of someone forfeits a measure of cash and then they let them go. So how effective is the legal framework in trying to make sure the prosecution and prevention of corruption in Nigeria?
Thank you very much for that question. Again, it's just sort of ties to what we were saying earlier on about the limitations of the law and order approach. So one of the reasons, for example, one of the reasons for the normalization of corruption in our society is the fact that there has not been effective implementation of, like you said, those legal mechanisms for prosecuting and bringing to book those who are engaged in corrupt practices or corrupt acts, right? And the result of that is this. The moment people begin to realize that I can get away with some things, right? Justice will not be served. Then it's okay. You just go ahead and just engage in the corrupt act regardless. When you do a simple cost-benefit analysis and you realize that the benefit of engaging in the corrupt act, even if you were caught, far outstrips the cost of it, you really don't care. You just damn it and just go ahead and do what's it. So one of the reasons, again, of course, that corruption becomes normalized, is because people have observed over time that there's not been adequate, effective legal prosecution and bringing people to book when they engage in such acts, right? And so when the law has not been effective. Of course, people just go ahead and do what they wish to do.
Of course, people will go ahead and do what they do where the law is very effective. And if you're just joining us, you're onto platform on the network service of Radio Nigeria. We'll return in a moment. Don't go anywhere, because I got in the studio my guest right here, and he's the Program Officer, Policy Innovation Center at the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, Mr. Femi Obidare. Once again, welcome to our studio.
Thank you.
Good to know you're still there. The program is still platform, and we have been discussing World Anti-Corruption Day and the fight against corruption in Nigeria. And I have with me in the studio the Program Officer, Policy Innovation Center at the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, Mr. Femi Obidare. Now, Mr. Femi, let's go to strategies. What strategies would you propose to enhance transparency and accountability in public institutions to just curb corruption?
Thank you very much. So, what the question you just raised is very critical, because it sort of embodies the new direction of thought that even some government anti-corruption agencies are beginning to take and adopt, like I mentioned earlier on, which essentially is to begin to, legislation is very important, law and order is very important, the rule of law is very critical, we understand that. But again, we want to begin to look beyond just the mechanisms of the law, right? Because you may go ahead and criminalize certain things, but we found out that cultural influences, right, societal influences, behavioral influences are a lot stronger in many ways than even the law itself, right? And so part of the new thought or the new thinking around the right kind of strategies to begin to deploy within public institutions, for example, even within private sector, really, is to begin to look at behavioral approaches, right, which essentially is to begin to use understanding around the context and the environment within which people act and behave to determine or influence their behavior in very subtle ways, right? For example, we all know that we're all products of environment and our societies, right? The context within which we grow largely influence our thinking and our reasoning, right? Yeah. So we're beginning to look at avenues through which, and this has proven effective in certain parts of the world, right? Avenues through which you can go beyond the law and begin to look at how the understanding of human behavior helps you to develop strategies or approaches, right, to influence the way people behave or the way people act. I'll give an example. So typically that when it comes to, say, recruitment within public space, the very fact that you know someone who is behind the recruitment process, and maybe for some reason you have some measure of connection to that person, automatically induces you in certain ways, even if you're not intending to. You want to leverage that influence you have, right, to see whether the person can make a decision in your favor or in favor for someone within your network. But imagine a situation where the process has been designed such that nobody knows the person who is making a decision, a recruitment decision, for example. Automatically, what you have done is that you've reduced the corruption risk in that context and in that situation. So before we even get to the matter of, say, what the law says or whatnot, by simply designing a process such that you have been able to curb the corruption or reduce the corruption risk, right? You're effectively fighting the possibility of corruption happening within that space. That's one of the approaches that we're advocating as part of the work we do, for example, Policy Innovation Center, and say, let's look at those other approaches that go beyond the law. That's one of them. Another mechanism or strategy that will prove a lot effective is to focus much more on preventive mechanisms than the punitive mechanism. The truth, the simple wisdom, is that an ounce of prevention is far better than a pound of cure, right? Yes. So if efforts are made to really focus on preventive measures within the systems generally, it helps to reduce even the corruption risks. And there are different ways, for example, that you can deploy preventive measures. For example, incorporating technology in, say, procurement processes.
Because I was going to ask you that. I was going to ask you how technology can be leveraged to address corruption
in
Nigeria. So Now that I've asked you, please be explicit.
That's very well. I mean, just before this show started, I was having the chat here, and we're talking about the matter of when it comes to technology, there's software, there's hardware, and there's humanware, to borrow the sense of. Now, the truth is this: humanware is really the major factor. I remember listening to a particular lecture the other time by Benga Shesong, and he said something quite profound. He said, a lot of times technology doesn't fail, it's humans that fail, right? So within processes, oftentimes when you reduce the human elements within processes, the truth is that you have a higher tendency, right, of reducing corruption risks. You understand there, and that's that. Another measure that also, a strategy that also can really help is that consistent reorientation. All right, it's very funny. The human nature, we tend to forget. Forgetfulness is really part of us, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but when there is deliberate, consistent reorientation of people in positions of power, influence, or authority, or in any office whatsoever, the consistent reorientation about the ills, how everybody pays for corruption, right? That consistent reorientation, and then deliberate monitoring of processes. Those things will help in many ways to curb corruption. There's one other thing, one very important strategy that I also think is not being emphasized in our society and within the system generally, and that is the celebration of people who have demonstrated integrity and are role models.
Like
right?
Reward system.
I mean, public celebration. It's positive reinforcement. Yeah, we don't have adequate of that. And that's the reason why a number of CSOs are pushing this effort, celebrating integrity icons, for example, that Accountability Lab does, and a number of folks like that. But we don't have that adequately in government yet. I mean, look at the honor roll of Nigeria, for example, the honor list of Nigeria, for example. The question is, how many of those people who hold those titles?
How honorable are they?
Well, I wouldn't even go to that extent. I would rather say that how many of those people were honored based on demonstrating integrity. You understand what I'm saying? Now, imagine if you have more people within that honor roll. Who gets them not because of political influence or because of being the richest in a particular community, but because of simply demonstrating integrity, and people are adequately rewarded for that. That's one mechanism that goes beyond the law that helps to advance the right kind of attitude when it comes to corruption. Yes.
Okay, away from the behavioral change now, let's discuss the potential consequences of corruption on foreign investment and international relations for Nigeria.
Well, one thing is certain, right? We know that corruption itself, international organizations understand this, that foreign direct investment is directly impacted by this. When it is clear to you that the resources that are being released into a particular system are practically going through the basket, right? And going through the basket as you're pouring them in. The outcome of that is that you discourage the continuous investment, right, by foreign organizations or foreign agencies, right? I think we saw that in the previous administration, where at the time the president was making efforts to get more funds from some of these international organizations, and they're like, hey guys, we will not do as much as you want us to do at this point. So generally, even beyond international organizations. Recently, you'd see how certain foreign organizations began to move their operation base out of Nigeria, out of the country, right? Which directly impacts jobs, impacts capital in the economy, impacts resources. And one of the major reasons these folks quote or cite is that, look, it's so expensive for us to do business in an environment where we are demanded to give kickbacks all the time, right?
So what happened to the ease of doing business?
It goes without saying. It is there, right? It's one of the. So you see, when we say that corruption actually affects every aspect, whether it is foreign investment or local investment, hey,
and all of
it's a big deal.
That you said something about companies moving out and then people losing jobs and all. Now, do you think there's a correlation between poverty and corruption?
Absolutely. There is a correlation between poverty and corruption. There's a school of, if you look at it very closely, you see that, yes, corruption does cause poverty. And in certain ways, poverty also sort of causes corruption. So there is a